There is a story that's been told many times to many different beings appropriately. But that story has always been left incomplete for a specific reason. That story is the story about the great Hindu Pandit Ramdas. Ramdas came from a long line of scholars right back to the great debater Shankara. And in his teachings to his students, of which he had many, Ramdas would always refer to them as being unique atoms in the body of Vishnu. Now, we know that to the Hindus, all of creation is played out in the body of Vishnu. So his teachings to his students was that they were integral atoms within creation, in the body of Vishnu. But then, one day, a very strange thing happened to Ramdas. He felt himself slipping, and uncontrollably, he found himself outside the body of Vishnu, in a vastness, eternal vastness, darkness. He was afraid. He began to flail around in this unknown territory. And then he brought all the faculties of his amazing mind, using mantras, affirmations, to bring back a faint outline of Vishnu. And then, with a supreme effort of his mind, he managed to have Vishnu put out his hand and pop him back in to the mouth. And he found himself back in creation. But of course, nothing was the same after this. He could no longer teach that all there was Vishnu and the activity within Vishnu's body. And he was never quite comfortable after this. And then, unexpectedly, it happened again, and he was outside Vishnu's mouth. And this time, no amount of effort of his amazing mind was able to so much as bring back the faintest misty outline of Vishnu. He flailed around for some time until he was so exhausted he could not flail anymore. And after a time, he found himself back in Vishnu's mouth, back in the world of creation. But never again did he teach. Nothing was ever the same again. The portion of this story that has always been omitted is that which lies between the moment when Ramdas was ejected for the second time out of Vishnu's mouth, and the moment when he is returned back into creation. The reason this was omitted was because we needed to live, experience our own story of what occurs when we too are ejected slip out of Vishnu's mouth into that vastness. Now there's an old allegory that brings the circle around and maybe allows us to relate, find the parallels between this story and what has occurred for us in that space that has lain between the moment we were ejected and the moment we returned to creation, back inside the world of movement again. Close your eyes. Come on a little allegorical journey and see how your own life's experiences may relate and bring us to a point where we can recognize that in filling in this gap, we arrive at a place where we can pass through what has been called a portal, a doorway into what lies beyond, or using that analogy, move out of the event horizon of the black hole, through the mouth of that is called that void, into what lies beyond, knowing that in accordance with that analogy, in the black hole, all of the light is squeezed out of our life. All of the illusions are effaced from our existence. Hamid was his name. He sat under a lone olive tree in a field with his master. And after spending some time with that master, he was about to leave, to return to his homeland. But in sitting with the one who had guided him over the last years of his life, his master said to him, "Before you depart, there is one last test for you to undertake. Look around you. Look at this field and look beyond." And as Hamid looked across the vastness of the field, there lay a mountain. And his master said to him, "You must ascend that mountain, because at its apex you will find the one who is the epitome of truth, the end of a journey and the beginning of a new, a doorway, an aperture in human form." His master said to him, "I will accompany you, but only with my voice, and the last part of the journey will be taken alone. Now stand and begin your last test. First of all, feel beneath your feet the solidness of the earth. Be intensely aware and alert throughout all of this experience, and heed my voice." Hamid walked And after a little while, he took off his sandals so that he could more greatly feel the softness, the changes that took place as he walked across the terrain. Here a patch of dirt, here the soft grass, here the prickles that sometimes grew out of the barren earth. And then he approached the mountain. He felt comfortable on the earth. It was solid under his feet, and there was some reluctance to begin that upward journey. A little fear rose in his heart, and his master's voice said, go on, begin your ascent. And stealing his resources, Hamid began the upward climb. He climbed and climbed. Arduous as it was, he became tired and a little breathless. But then he heard a sound, the sound of water, and making a movement towards that sound, he came upon a great cascade, a waterfall tumbling down from the rocks high up, down into a pool where it had created a huge whirlpool, an eddy, spinning in circles which went out, bouncing off the edges of the pond. He stopped, mesmerized by the sounds and the spin. And suddenly he had an experience. The experience that instead of being an observer of the sensory experiences, the sound of the cascade tumbling, roaring in his ears, the swirling, the eddying of the water into the vortex, the spray that touched his face. It seemed as though the water was speaking to him, drawing him in. It was as though he had never known how to listen before. Always his senses had been out there, but now it seemed that in its communication with him, his senses had become open, and they became themselves the experiences of the water. Suddenly, Hamid heard his master's voice. Do not be drawn into this earthly experience of this element. Go on. Hamid had a great effort in drawing himself back from this, but gathering himself up, he moved on and upward, and soon he came into a vast area of pine trees. In these trees The outside world was blotted out. The sun did not penetrate the tall pine trees, lifting themselves up to gather the sunlight, and in so doing, blocking out the light. Hamid had a little fear, but intrepidly he went on, and it seemed that even though his master's voice was not in his ears verbally, that he was being encouraged to pass through this darkness. And then suddenly he came to a level where the trees came to an end and the sun came blazing down, clear. His master's voice spoke in his ear, "Bask in this element of life. Feel the sun on your skin. Feel its aspects of warmth, heat, its ability to create, destroy, and preserve. Feel it." And as Hamid experienced these aspects of the sun, again he felt himself being lost in these great qualities. It was though he was being drawn into a kind of sleep. And just as he felt himself being lost in the aspects of the sun, his master's voice said, "No, do not be seduced by the powers of this part of creation. Go on." So Hamid again, with a great effort, shook himself and again began the ascent. Now it was clearer and clearer. And then the voice of his master spoke to him again and said, "You are now nearing the domain of the greatest of the powers of creation. Stay awake, stay alert, go to the edge of the precipice that lies ahead." Hamid, with great effort, climbed the craggy rocks until he came to what was the edge of the rocky outcrop. "Go to the edge," said his master's voice. Hamid stood at the very, very tip, looking out into the greatness of what lay beyond. And suddenly he felt a power, the power of the ethers, the power of the airs. It seemed that they flowed around and through him like a great wind, a wind that encapsulated all of the other winds. No coherency here, just the combining of the great forces of the ether, which seemed to enter him and fill him with a vast power that made him feel like an eagle, that he could fly, that it could lift him up and take him out to places and experiences that lay beyond the ken of those who are bound with their senses to the material world. But his master's voice cautioned him again. Do not be seduced by this great force of creation. There is yet a ways to go. From here on, you must go alone. Hamid again, with tremendous effort, drew himself back from the edge of the precipice, and the power that swirled through and around him, and turned again to the craggy rocks that rose up behind him. He began the climb until he came to a little opening through which he had to squeeze with great effort, like he was between a rock and a hard place. This tiny aperture was barely large enough for him to edge his way through. But finally, he came out and saw before him a ledge, knowing that it was his destination. He climbed over the ledge, and there before him was a being seated on a rock, a being such as he'd never seen before, but human in form, and when looking at the features, each of them seemed to be the epitome of what one would expect in a perfected being, whatever that might be. Hamid's master's voice, no longer a voice, merely a feeling within him, brought to Hamid a great sense of stillness, a great sense that there was nowhere else for him to be, but now seated before this being at the crest of the great mountain. And as he gazed at this being, and the being gazed at him, Hamid's being, in its stillness, seemed to become almost like the rock on which the divine perfected being sat, like a stone, so still was he. And as he gazed, the stillness changed. It became like a vast void, There was no longer any possibility. There was no longer anything left to resist, nor to surrender. It was not a vastness that enveloped him, encompassed him. There was no difference between the stone of his being, and that emptiness. As he sat, something stirred within him. Was it his master's voice? Was it the voice without words of the perfected being who had sat before him? Or was it he opened his eyes, and all had changed. No longer a void, no longer emptiness, no longer senses in the way that he had experienced before. All was new, and yet as his eyes scanned the horizon, there was the field below him. There were the trees that he had passed through on his way. There was the precipice on which he had stood. There even was the great cascade, the tumbling water. But as he made his descent down the mountain, he knew that life had just begun. Can you, in finding the parallels of your experiences, not only relate to them, but recognize that you too have completed this phase that fills that story with the complete enactment of what occurs when we're outside Vishnu's mouth and before we find ourselves back inside creation. In doing so, we move into that place, that state, the analogy of which is to pass through the aperture into the body of the black hole, where the last vestiges, traces of illusion are squeezed out of our life.